Hey, what's up? It's Kinsey, here to talk about the 5 things that scared me the most about coming out as asexual and how I moved past those fears and came out anyway. Let's face it, coming out is scary. Whether it's about your orientation or your gender or both, openly admitting that you're queer in a largely queerphobic world is not easy. And even when you're surrounded by supportive people, it can still be really intimidating. But living your truth and being your authentic self, if it's safe for you to do so, is much, much better than spending your life pretending to be someone you're not. So it is absolutely worth it to push past those fears and bust down that closet door. When I started questioning my orientation, I was afraid to come out to myself for a long time, much less anybody else. I know the point of questioning is to try to figure out the answer, but a part of me didn't want the answer that was starting to seem most likely. And allowing myself to even think the words "I am asexual" made it all seem way too real. Especially because if I knew I was ace, then eventually I would need to tell other people, and that felt even scarier. So just in case any of you are in a similar situation right now, I want to dig deep into why I was so afraid to come out, where those fears came from, and how I got over them. So without further ado, let's get into my 5 greatest fears about coming out as ace. Number 1, no one would believe me. By the time I figured out I was ace, I was 26 years old. And at that point, most people are pretty sure about their orientation, right? That's the time frame when a lot of my peers were settling into long-term relationships and even starting families with their partners. And here I was just now figuring out that I didn't experience sexual attraction. I have had long-term relationships with 2 people in the past, and my friends knew that about me. So I felt like trying to explain how my sexual orientation worked would really seem like I was coming out of left field. I was scared they wouldn't understand the difference between romantic versus sexual feelings, or that they would think I was just making excuses for why those past relationships didn't work out, or that they would think I was not really ace but just had some weird hang-ups about sex. And aside from my relationship history, my friends also knew that I am not even remotely sex repulsed. A lot of people think asexual and sex repulsed mean the same thing, but they don't. And this is something I addressed in one of my other videos about common misconceptions around asexuality, which I have linked in case you want to check that out. I enjoy erotic art and fiction. I make sex jokes all the time. One of my favorite films is the Rocky Horror Picture Show. You get the idea. So, in light of all that, I was afraid that my friends would tell me there was no way I could really be ace. And of course, asexuality is also one of those orientations that a lot of people have just never even heard of. When most of us come out as ace, we can't just say, "I'm ace," the way you might say, "I'm gay." We have to explain what it means. So I was scared no one would believe me because they wouldn't know what asexuality was and therefore wouldn't think it was a real orientation. So how did I get over this fear? Baby steps. I started coming out to other people slowly, just testing the waters, and I chose the lowest stakes, lowest risk situations to do that. Actually, the very first time I ever came out to another person, I was standing in line for a signing at a Comic-Con, chatting with the random strangers in front of me, and everyone started sharing their coming out stories. And when one person talked about coming out as ace, I just went, "Oh my god, you're ace? Me too." And I kind of just kept doing that until I was out to all of the friends I had made through the cosplay community. And guess what? They all believed me. So that gave me the courage to start coming out to all my older friends, the ones I'd known since college or high school, and the ones whose reaction I feared the most because I didn't want to lose those long-term friendships. But of course, they all believed me too. And after I came out to all my friends, I've even had a few of them confide in me that they were on the asexual spectrum themselves. There have been a few times where some of my friends were confused or surprised by the fact that I'm asexual but not sex repulsed, but none of them ever tried to invalidate my asexuality because of it, and all of them have been really open to learning about the difference, which is awesome. So if you're afraid to come out as ace because you're worried that no one will believe you, I bet more people will believe you than you think. And if they don't, they never really respected you in the first place, and you don't need them in your life. You can find people who will believe you and who will support you, and those are the people you want to keep around. Number 2, I wouldn't be accepted as queer. If you start your questioning process by looking into asexuality and the ace community online, one thing you'll probably encounter right away is the discourse. This is basically people debating whether or not asexuals belong in the queer community, and I saw this all the time when I was questioning. So that made me worry that if I came out as ace, I wouldn't be accepted by my queer friends as one of them. Before I get any further into this, I just want to make one thing extremely clear. When it comes to the queer community, I am always 100% on the side of inclusion. So, yes, asexuality is a queer orientation. Yes, aces belong in the queer community. End of story. This should not even be up for debate. But when I was still in my questioning and baby ace stages, I saw so many other queer people online saying aces don't count that I unfortunately internalized that message and wonder whether that was how most of the community felt. And of course, it didn't help that I was figuring this all out so much later in life than any of my other queer friends. They all figured out their orientations as kids or teens, and here I was staring 30 in the face and just now coming to terms with the fact that I wasn't straight. And I was worried that my journey wouldn't seem legitimate compared to theirs just because of the age thing. But then when you throw an orientation like asexuality into the mix, this orientation that might or might not be queer, that might or might not even be real, I didn't even know how to approach coming out. One of the reasons people give for why they don't think aces count as queer is because we aren't visible targets for discrimination in the same way that, let's say, a gay couple walking down the street holding hands might be. And when I heard that argument, I didn't want it to seem like I was appropriating the struggles of my gay friends when I came out to them, or like I was trying to get my foot in the door of a community that I didn't really belong in. But then I started thinking about this with actual logic, and that made the whole idea that aces aren't oppressed enough to be queer fall flat on its face. First of all, aces do face discrimination. It might not look the same as the discrimination that a gay couple or a visibly trans person might face, but it's still discrimination nonetheless. Asexuals have been medicalized and pathologized and sent to conversion therapy and subjected to corrective rape and treated in all kinds of other terrible ways because society just cannot accept a lack of sexual attraction as a legitimate thing. But also, that same argument that real queer people face discrimination is used against lots of other members of the queer community, not just aces. For example, bisexuals or pansexuals in straight-passing relationships or trans people who pass as cis are often told the same thing. If cis-passing or straight-passing queer folks don't face discrimination, and that's a big if, the only reason for that is because their queerness is being erased. Plus, being queer isn't about suffering, it's not the oppression Olympics, and I think it only hurts us more as a community when we center that kind of oppression and pain as a key part of our experience. So that was ultimately what got me over my fear about not being accepted as a queer person if I came out as ace. I was armed with some airtight logic in case anyone tried to invalidate me with the discourse. And that gave me all the confidence I needed to start coming out to the other queer people in my life and trust that they would accept me as one of their own, which is exactly what they did. I have been to multiple pride events with ace-themed colors and waving my ace flag around, and all I've ever gotten in response to that is compliments and support. No one has ever tried to tell me I didn't belong there. In fact, no queer person has ever tried to tell me that I didn't count, period. So if you encounter the discourse a lot online, please do not let that make you afraid to come out to the queer people you know in real life. I think the internet gives a lot of cowards an easy way to bully people from behind a screen that they would never do to someone's face, and you are so much more likely to be accepted by your queer friends and at your local pride events than the internet would have you believe. Number 3. My asexuality would be pathologized. Earlier, I mentioned that a lot of people tend to mix up asexuality with sex repulsion. Well, another thing they mix it up with is sexual dysfunction, and that's why I talked about how medicalizing and pathologizing asexuality is a form of discrimination that can happen. The thing is, asexuals are a small minority of the population. The usual statistic you hear is about 1%. I suspect it might be a little higher, but we'll go with that. And although there have always been asexuals in the population, the language we have to describe ourselves is relatively new. So when you compound that with a society where sex is the norm and sex education is severely lacking, you end up with this assumption that being asexual means you are somehow broken. So because of that, one of my greatest fears about coming out as ace was being told, oh, there's a pill that can fix that. Before I even knew the word asexual, I was already getting quite a bit of skepticism from medical professionals when they would ask the standard questions, and I would always answer no to, are you sexually active? It was like they just could not believe a 20-something person wouldn't be having sex and that I must be lying. And I can kind of understand why they would think that, because we live in a culture of shame around sex. And again, that's largely due to that lack of sex education we have. So when you grow up feeling ashamed about sex, you might be embarrassed to admit that you're having it, even in confidence to your doctor. But that wasn't me. I really was just not having sex because I didn't want to. And once I did have the language to explain that I was asexual, I was afraid that if I tried to tell a doctor that was why I wasn't sexually active, that their response would be something like, oh, well, maybe we could try this drug to fix that, or maybe we need to get your hormone levels checked. Side note, I am quite obviously running on the wrong hormones, but that's a whole other issue altogether. But that's actually one of the biggest things that got me over this fear. Coming out to my doctors, not as ace, but as trans. I'll be honest, I haven't actually discussed my asexuality with any of my doctors because there just hasn't been a reason for it to come up. But if I can come out to them as non-binary transgender, which felt a lot riskier to me personally, and which I have done successfully, then I don't think I would have any problems or any fears about coming out to them as ace. Ironically enough, the only time my asexuality has been pathologized was not in fact by a doctor, but by a relative who did not believe it was a real thing when I came out and said, oh, that sounds like sexual dysfunction to me. So I think being afraid of that very thing, and then actually having it happen and realize it wasn't so bad because I could just ignore everything else this person ever said, really helped me get over the hurdle of that fear. I will say that coming out to any medical professionals is really, really hard in general, because it can be hard enough to find a doctor or a care team that you like, and then you worry about, okay, what if I come out and then find out that they're queer-phobic, and then this practice that I otherwise really like to go to will suddenly not be safe for me anymore. But sometimes it really is important to come out to your doctors, like in my case when I needed to start seeking gender-affirming treatment. So because of that, I think it is worth it to take that risk and face that fear. And yes, it may end up screwing up a doctor-patient relationship that you otherwise liked, but you don't want an unsupportive person managing your health, do you? I mean, I think of it the same way that I think of coming out to friends and family. Yes, you may lose someone who you consider to be an important part of your life, but if they're not going to respect who you are, they don't need to be a part of your life in the first place. Number 4, people would feel sorry for me. I've always been the kind of person who hates being on the receiving end of pity. The last thing I ever want to hear from anyone is, oh, you poor thing. Your life must be so hard. I don't know how you do it. I find that sort of thing insulting and infantilizing and patronizing, and I just don't want to hear it. So imagine my shock and horror when I started looking into asexuality and finding out that that is actually how a lot of people respond when they find out someone is ace. There is this really pervasive attitude that somehow being asexual is just the worst thing ever, that it must be so awful not to be able to experience sexual attraction like everyone else. I have seen tons of comments online about how asexuals must have just sad and boring lives, how we must feel lonely or unfulfilled, how it's too bad that we can't experience real love or deep connections with other people, how much we're missing out on. And I hate it because although none of that is true, it can be all too easy to believe. I think that's a big part of why this was such a major fear for me, because fear of coming out was tied to fear of missing out. I am the kind of person who really likes to try new things and have new experiences, and most of my biggest regrets in life are about things I haven't done. So I was worried that not only would people feel sorry for me if I came out to them as ace, but that they would also be right, that I was missing out on some vital part of the human experience. And that terrified me. But here's the thing, you don't always have to try something to know you won't like it. Would you enjoy sticking your hand in a pot of boiling water, or stepping in a hornet's nest, or falling into a briar patch? No? How do you know? Don't knock it till you've tried it. And of course, it's no different with sex, right? If you don't experience sexual attraction, then it's perfectly reasonable to come to the conclusion that you wouldn't enjoy having sex with anyone. Or maybe you would. I mean, some aces do like it, or at the very least don't hate it. But you are under no obligation to try it just to find out. I think this idea that aces are somehow missing out, or that we have these very sad, unfulfilled lives, comes from living in a sex-obsessed world. Whether you come from a culture where sex is celebrated and put on a pedestal, or shamed and shrouded in silence, or perhaps both at the same time in different contexts, it's still this important cultural touchstone of our society. Which means a lot of people have a hard time wrapping their minds around something like the concept of asexuality. And you end up with this attitude of, aw, asexual? That sounds so sad. I once had a friend ask me what being asexual was like, and the first word that came to my mind was invincible. There's something about my ace orientation that feels like a superpower. It is the exact opposite of sad. It is absolutely not a reason for people to feel sorry for me. And it's that invincible feeling that got me over this particular fear. I told myself, if I come out with confidence and make it clear from the get-go that I am more than happy to be asexual, then no one will have a reason to feel sorry for me. And guess what? They haven't. This is why pride is so important, y'all. Number 5. It would be an automatic relationship deal breaker. I'm gonna be completely honest, this was actually my greatest fear about coming out as asexual, not only to anyone else, but also to myself. And if you know how I feel about relationships or what my romantic orientation is, then you may kind of be thinking, why would you be afraid of that? Well, buckle up because this one is complicated. The thing that made me start questioning my orientation in the first place was the end of my last romantic relationship back in 2012. And just for a little bit of context, I've only ever had romantic relationships with 2 people. They were long-term committed relationships, and I'm the kind of person who just doesn't experience romantic feelings for people very often, and I don't commit to a relationship like that unless I believe it has the potential to last forever. And as for sexual feelings, I always had just kind of assumed that those would happen one day at the right time with the right person. But when I finally had the right person, someone I could see myself spending the rest of my life with, and all the romantic feelings were there, but the only sexual feelings I had were not so much attraction, but more like a mix of curiosity and a sense of obligation, well, you can probably tell why that didn't work out. So not only did I have to process the end of this 2-year relationship with someone I thought I would be with for the rest of my life, but I also, for the first time, had to contend with this idea that my lack of sexual feelings were not just normal for my age anymore. So here I was, questioning my orientation later in life, realizing that the most likely answer was that I was ace, and thinking, oh God, please no, because if I'm ace, who is ever going to want to date me? Won't that always be a deal breaker? I felt like acknowledging my asexuality meant admitting that I had no romantic future. Fortunately, I did get over this fear, although that process was pretty complicated as well. The first thing that helped was understanding that it was not my asexuality that ended my relationship. It was the fact that I didn't know I was ace. I didn't have the language for it, so of course I had no way to explain it to my partner. Instead, I constantly felt pressured, my partner constantly felt unsatisfied, and this fundamental incompatibility kept getting worse and worse until it eventually blew up in our faces. But once I knew I was ace, I also knew I could explain that to any potential partners going forward and avoid misunderstandings like this one happening in the future. The second thing that helped was just making more new friends through my local cosplay community. I met other aces this way for the first time, including some who were in happy relationships. At one point I was talking to someone, whatever the heck that means, and when I disclosed my asexuality, it actually didn't end up being the automatic deal breaker I had always feared. Instead, the other person asked a lot of really respectful and insightful questions about it. And even though we didn't end up dating, that experience still made me feel a whole lot better about coming out as ace to other potential partners in the future. I even had a few situations that made me realize my asexuality could be the deal breaker from my side. So I could tell someone who was interested, hey, if you place a lot of importance on sex in a relationship, then you're not the one for me. The third thing that helped was figuring out my romantic orientation, which is also aspec. I originally came across the asexual community by way of the term demisexual, and demi means that you're only capable of being attracted to someone after you have a deep emotional connection or bond with them. That seemed to fit my pattern of only ever wanting to date people who I knew really well and was friends with, so for a while I used the term demisexual to describe myself. But once I learned about the split attraction model, I started using the label demi-romantic asexual. And once I realized I was demi-romantic, I also started to understand that I vastly preferred my aromantic periods, these long stretches of time that I had between kind of rare instances of romantic attraction, much more than experiencing those romantic feelings and being in a romantic relationship. Don't get me wrong, if I am romantically attracted to someone, then I'm all in. My feelings run extremely deep and I will try my hardest to make it work. But if I could control my romantic orientation, I would 100% choose to just be aromantic rather than being in this more gray part of the spectrum where I do still get hit with the feels sometimes. So that really chipped away at this fear of my asexuality always being a romantic deal breaker. Because if I would be happier never having another romantic relationship again, who cares if I'm ace? It doesn't matter. And of course, the fourth thing that helped was discovering an even bigger deal breaker about myself than my asexuality, which was my gender. Like it or not, the reality is that I am much more likely to get rejected for being trans than for being ace. So that makes the idea of coming out as ace to a potential romantic partner seem like no big deal at all. Plus, can you imagine how that conversation would go? Hey, so before we go on a date, there's something you should know. I'm trans. Oh, sorry, I don't think this is gonna work out. I only cis dudes. Wait, you thought we were gonna So now I can safely say that this fear has gone away completely. I don't know what my romantic future entails or if I'll even have one. I mean, preferably not, but unfortunately I can't 100% rule it out. But no matter what happens, at least now I know how to account for my asexuality when it comes to determining whether I would be compatible with someone. And that's way more than I had in my romantic relationships before. Okay, that wraps up my list of fears and everything I did to overcome them. Have you ever been scared to come out? Not just as ace, but as anything else. What were you afraid of? How have you faced those fears? Have you ever just said screw it and come out anyway, even if you were still scared? Please feel free to share your thoughts and experiences and questions down in the comments below, and let's get a discussion going. If you want to reach out to me on other social media, I am GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I have more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person. I have cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, pre-testosterone voice recordings, and more right here on this channel. So make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for your support. I hope you learned a lot, and I will see you on the next one.